Just over 4 years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine and in March of 2022 bombed a theater in Mariupol, killing countless numbers of civilians. And this war has continued on and on and on, most recently over the weekend with the escalation on the part of Russia towards bombings in Kyiv, killing even more people. And it has been an awful thing to witness here in the United States for the last 4 years. One guy I know was over in Ukraine, James Verini. He just wrote a book called The Theater, Courage and Survival in the Defining Atrocity of the Ukraine War. And he joins us today to talk about what he saw, what he is continuing to see in Ukraine, the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, the long history between the two peoples, what he sees moving forward, what Putin's endgame is, what Zelensky's approaches are, what role the United States has in the conflict, and what hope we have for some sort of end to the war. This is as raw of a conversation as we've ever had here on this podcast. I just recorded it just a few moments ago, and we're turning it around right now to get it on for you today. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. This is a real conversation about what's really going on in Ukraine right now today, all of its historical antecedents, and thoughts on maybe what comes next. So I'm Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is A Reckoning. You're what, back in New York right now, is that right?
I am, yeah. I've got a sort of mini book tour I'm doing in the States, yeah.
So I was kind of following some of the stuff that you've done, and I'm kind of wondering, is time just a complete abstract at this point in time? Is everything in a haze? Is like going back and forth where you're at?
How do you mean? In terms of the work I do?
Yeah, the
or?
work, you spent this time in Ukraine, you're back in New York now, and so forth. You're heading off to these other places for these next assignments. Like,
yeah.
How do you even have like an internal clock at this point in time? Or is it just constantly just whatever?
Well, my favorite thing is when you're working so hard and you're so immersed that you forget what day it is.
Yeah.
If I'm working, say, in Ukraine or Iraq or anywhere else, or even Nashville, for that matter, my last New Yorker story, and I kind of look up and realize I don't know what day it is, that's a good thing. I mean, right? Assuming it's not because I'm like hungover, but if, I've just been working so hard for so long, and when you're in the field in Ukraine, for instance, you don't have unlimited time, so you have to work every day. You don't take Saturdays and Sundays off. You do interviews every day. You work every day. That's the best feeling to me. When I guess to answer your question, the best feeling is when time disappears, when the notion of time disappears. Yeah. And because when you're in a place like that, to use a cliche, you have to be as present as possible, right? You have to be as aware as possible. You have to be as attentive as possible to other people. And time kind of vanishes, which is really nice.
Yeah, I marveled, James, at reading this book.
Thank you.
Thank you, man. Like I read this on my way back and forth to Florida last week. I just absolutely loved it. And I guess here's my segue, my first rotten segue of the morning. Is we're talking about time here. Do you want to bring us back here to about 4 years ago, and let's just jump into this story here about what happens in Mariupol in March of 22, and like why is this such an awful, awful thing?
So the war begins February 24th, 2022, and the siege of Mariupol begins simultaneous to the beginning of the war. So you remember that the Russians moved on four main Ukrainian cities on four different axes, or actually more than four different axes, towards Kyiv, Kharkiv, Mariupol, and Kherson. Mariupol quickly turned into the only theater where things went something like to plan for the Russian forces. The invasion was incompetent and disastrous from the first days. But in Mariupol, the Russian forces performed something like to plan. And within a few days, they had encircled the city. And within a few days more, Mariupol was under full siege. So that by early March, Mariupol was without any municipal services, no water, no gas, no heat, no electricity, no internet, no phone. The only other city the Russians managed to take at the beginning of the war was Kherson, which, of course, they lost the following year when the Ukrainians liberated it. But even in Kherson, the conditions were this bad. They were not bad in any portion of Ukraine that Russia invaded. Mariupol was in a particularly unpropitious place, or propitious if you were a Russian, for an invasion of this sort, because it was very near the Russian border and even nearer the border of what at the time was called the Donetsk People's Republic, this satrapy that Putin had been running since 2014 that broke off from Ukraine with separatists and Russians. So Mariupol was right on the border of the DPR, not much farther from the border of Russia, and then also on the Sea of Azov, and it was very near two Russian air bases. So the Russians and Chechens and Burats and other people fighting alongside them were able to besiege Mariupol much more easily than they could, say, Kharkiv or, of course, Kyiv or even Kherson. And the siege lasted for 81 days. Until finally the last remaining Ukrainian soldiers in the Azovstal steel plant surrendered. But so beginning of March, the city is under full siege. It's fully encircled. No one can get in or out. No humanitarian provisions are being allowed in by the Russians. And Mariupol, within a few days of the beginning of the siege, becomes a humanitarian disaster. At the very beginning of the siege, the city government of Mariupol published a list of buildings where people should go take refuge in the event of the siege, in the event of a siege. The city government of Mariupol didn't anticipate a full siege, oddly enough. No one really did. Oddly, people had convinced themselves that if the Russians did undertake a full-scale invasion, they wouldn't besiege Mariupol. The reasons vary as to why they thought this, but they were wrong, of course. So within a few days of the siege beginning, people were fleeing to this approved list of refugee shelters that the city government had published. The problem is that none of these places were equipped to take refugees. And most of them were the basements of the old Khrushchevsky apartment buildings in Mariupol. And these basements were not at all equipped to house refugees, much less refugees, in the winter during a siege. Simultaneously, the government published a list of larger buildings where people could take refuge. And one of those was the Mariupol Drama Theater. So people started going there knowing that the basement there was quite secure, and that it was a large building that could accommodate a lot of people. On March 5th of 2022, the government of Ukraine announced that there would be a humanitarian corridor created between Ukraine and the city of Zaporizhia, that the Russians had agreed to stop fighting along this highway. And the Mariupolitsi were told to gather at one of three places to get onto a convoy of evacuation buses. And one of those places was the theater. So beginning on March 5th, hundreds and then thousands of people gathered at the theater, hoping to get into one of these evacuation convoys. The problem is that the humanitarian corridor was never really created, and the Russians bombed the bus depot that held all the buses that were supposed to evacuate the Mariupolitsi under siege. So there was no way for these people to get out. And it was still much too dangerous along the roads to try to get out on your own, in your own car or however. And so all of these people ended up moving into the Mariupol Drama Theater around March 5th and March 6th. And the theater existed as a refugee shelter for until March 16th, when it was bombed by the Russians.
So what happens? I guess I got a couple questions here. It's like you've got this entire city that is encircled, surrounded by the Russians here, and now you've got these continual bombings now of these what are civilian targets here. You've got this bus depot, and then obviously this theater. James, isn't this the very definition of war crime?
So I would say that once I call this the bombing of the theater the defining atrocity of the Ukraine war, not just because it may be the most lethal in that the most civilians died there. A civilian atrocity, I should point out. It might be the most lethal atrocity of the war in that it's possible the most civilians died there. We'll never know how many people died in the theater, but it was defining more in the sense that you're getting at, which is it was with the bombing of the theater that we realized, the world realized, and Ukraine realized even more pointedly just how interested in killing civilians Russia was. So in the weeks before the bombing of the theater, in the first 2.5 or 3 weeks of the war and the siege of Mariupol, there were munitions hitting civilian structures, residential buildings, hospitals. There was famously the bombing of the maternity hospital in Mariupol. But it was, we also knew at the time, we being journalists in Ukraine and the Ukrainians and the world watching, that the Russian invasion was so incompetent and the targeting of the munitions was so incompetent and so archaic. So many of these munitions were not laser guided. The intelligence apparently signals intelligence was dreadful. They were using outdated maps. So it was unclear at first just how much the Russians intended to target civilian structure, as in how much they might have been mistaking civilian structures for military structures, or believing that there were military installations within civilian structures, which does happen in war. But I would argue that it wasn't until the theater was bombed that it became clear, oh, the Russians really are intent on killing Ukrainian civilians, not just combatants, but civilians. And that's how one of the survivors of the theater put it to me. She said, on that day, we realized why the Russians were here. They were not here to fight Ukrainian soldiers. They were not here to fight NATO soldiers, who Russia claimed, Ukraine was overrun with NATO soldiers. They weren't here to fight supposed neo-Nazis. They were here to kill us. And by us, she meant Ukrainians, everyday Ukrainians. But I think to anyone paying attention to what Putin had been saying for years before this invasion, it shouldn't have come as that much of a surprise. It was, I think, with the bombing of the theater that we really learned that we had to take Putin at his word. Because for years, Putin had been claiming, between 2014 and 2022, and then with increasing frequency and vehemence before the full-scale invasion, Putin had been claiming in speeches and essays that there was no such thing as the Republic of Ukraine, that there was no Ukraine, there was no independent state there, or if there was, it was the result of a Western cartographical conspiracy. It didn't deserve to exist outside of Greater Russia, that there was no independent Ukrainian culture, no Ukrainian language aside from the Russian language. So he had been stating quite clearly he didn't believe Ukraine existed, or if it didn't deserve to exist. But no one knew how seriously to take him. Because typically until 2022, Putin is a pretty rational actor. All of his military actions to that time were, even when they were brutal, I mean, they were always brutal, they were always quite calculated, and he was always quite risk averse. This war was something else again. This came out of a different, more irrational part of his brain. And with the bombing of the theater, Ukrainians and the world had to say, oh, we must take him at his word when he claims that Ukraine doesn't exist as a place or doesn't deserve to exist. He is willing to kill whoever it takes to make that point.
All right. So here's the thing I've got here, James. As an Americanist, I'm watching this from the outside, and I've got a general understanding of a rough Russian history and a rough Russian geography in my head, but I don't know the long history of the relationship,
Yeah,
say, between Ukraine, Crimea. You're talking about some of these other Chechnya, and all
yeah,
these other places. Can we talk a little bit, just quickly? Can we set the stage? Because I don't know that people
sure.
really get. I think there's a sense of like Putin bad, war bad,
Yeah.
but we don't really understand the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, and this
Hmm.
also like where Ukraine sits. This area you talk about this in the book, the Donbas. Um, why is this place so strategically important, and
Hmm.
how is it kind of connected culturally
Hmm.
to these people?
Well, it's a good question because it's my belief, and I've written about this, that if you really want to understand this war, you've got to go back to the mid 19th century. You've got to go back to the Crimean War of the 1850s, which is when the Russian Empire was at its height in terms of size and geography. But it was also with the Crimean War in the 1850s that the empire, particularly Nicholas I, the Tsar Nicholas I, and the intellectual circle around him, known as the Slavophiles, it was in the 1850s around that they decided that Russia was something that had to be anti-Western. It had to be antithetical to Western Europe and the United States, and that the Russian tradition was something different until then. So to set the stage, let's go back. We'll go back a few generations um, under Catherine the Great, and then under Alexander I. So we're talking late 18th century, early 19th century. The Russian Empire becomes the biggest empire the world has ever seen, or to this day, bigger than the Roman Empire, certainly bigger than the British Empire, which was disconnected colonies. But if you want to talk about contiguous landmass, the Russian Empire extended all the way from St. Petersburg in the west to the Pacific in the east, and all the way down to the Black Sea in the south to the Arctic in the north. It's geographically, the biggest empire the world has ever seen. Um, um, and as of the early 19th century, it is ruled by people like Alexander I and Catherine the Great, and before Peter the Great, who are very westernized. The court language in Russia until the mid 19th century was French. The Russian elite and the courtiers and indeed the czars and czarinas, they spoke French or German or English. Russian was their fourth choice for languages that they liked to speak in the court. There were certain Russian elites who never spoke Russian. They considered it an inferior language. And that persisted all the way up into the mid 19th century with Nicholas I, the Tsar Nicholas I, who he was also, like all his forebears in the Romanov family, he was steeped in European culture, steeped in French and German and British culture. But in the 1850s, Britain and France turned against Russia in the Crimean War. They sided with Turkey, with the Ottoman Empire, against Russia, and Russia lost Crimea. And Nicholas I decided not only were they traitorous, but as it turned out, Russia should have never had any reverence for Europe. Alexander I had considered himself a protege of Europe and the savior of Europe when he, ran Napoleon out of Moscow, and he went to the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and decided that all of Europe, including Russia, had to band together to prevent another war like this. 2 generations later, Nicholas I says, "No, we are Russia. We are something completely different. Our roots lay in Byzantium. Our roots lay in the Kievan Rus. We speak a different language, a Slavic language. We have a different church, the Russian Orthodox Church. We are nothing to do with Europe. And in fact, Europe represents this moral threat to Russia." This might begin to sound familiar. There's another person who's currently living who makes exactly these arguments. So it was under Nicholas I and the people around him called the Slavophiles, these Russian intellectuals, and they started developing this very rabid nativism around Russian heritage and the Russian language. Just around the same time with the Crimean War, Ukrainian independence was beginning to be a thing. There were Ukrainian intellectuals and nationalists who were speaking Ukrainian. They were writing in Ukrainian. They were talking about native Ukrainian literature going back to the 12th century. They were writing their own Ukrainian literature, putting on Ukrainian language plays. So right at the same time that Russia is detaching itself from the West, you get Ukraine sort of declaring its independence, its cultural independence, and then not much long after attempting to declare its independence as a state. This was immediately countered by the czars. Tsar Alexander II prohibited the teaching of the Ukrainian languages, prohibited Ukrainian language publications, as did his successor Nicholas II, as did Stalin. So beginning in the mid-19th century, you get this Ukrainian nationalist movement, both in terms of statehood and culture, that's trying to make itself known and heard, but is being repressed at first just culturally and then violently, physically repressed. And going back to the 19th century, the sort of the intellectual argument over the fate of the Russian Empire in the 19th century was between this group, the Slavophiles, who were Russian, very much Russian nationalists, and a group called the Westernizers, who were Russians who believed that that Russia must look to the West if the empire was going to have any sort of future. In fact, if it was going to cease to be an empire and become, a modern state. And there were famous Russian intellectuals such as Alexander Herzen, probably being the most famous, who argued this position, that if Russia was going to become a modern place and not a medieval place, as it essentially was until the early 20th century, that it had to look to Western Europe. And their opponents said no. But interestingly, the one point that the Slavophiles and the Westernizers could agree on was that they all had contempt for Ukraine. They all poo-pooed the notion that there was any such thing as Ukrainian culture outside of Russian culture. They all had disdain for the Ukrainian language. They all thought a Ukrainian state was a very bad idea. So Russians on either side of the question of empire and on either side of the political spectrum could agree on their contempt for Ukraine. And that continued up through the Soviet Union and into the 1990s. So, under the Soviet Union, Ukraine was arguably, not arguably, it was certainly the second most important Soviet republic after Russia itself. It's where Khrushchev had grown up, was in Ukraine. It's where Trotsky had been from. I think Brezhnev spent a good deal of his young life there, as did Gorbachev. And it was, of course, an industrial hub, particularly in the region known as the Donbas. It was one of the great industrial hubs first of the Tsarist Empire, then of the Soviet Union, and the breadbasket of Russia, if not of the Soviet Union, if not of Europe as a whole. Ukraine was hugely productive. But Ukrainians, of course, there had been a nationalist movement there beginning in the mid-19th century. And then in the 1830s, there was what is known as the Holodomor, which was the sort of imposed famine and some would say attempted genocide against Ukrainian residents perpetrated by Stalin and Khrushchev. So throughout the 20th century, there was Ukrainian nationalist sentiment in Ukraine. But the Soviet, of course, did everything it could just to suppress it. Although the nationalists, the nationalists who were fighting for a separate Ukraine weren't actually stamped out until after Stalin died in the mid-1950s. So get to 1991, Soviet Union disintegrates. Ukraine becomes independent almost overnight. Yeltsin signs an agreement with Leonid Kuchma, and also with Belarus and Kazakhstan, naming them the first independent republics to come out of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union therefore collapses. And Ukrainians vote en masse for independence, and something like 80% of Ukrainians vote to become independent. But within a few years, things have gotten so bad economically, socially, within Ukraine, just as they have within post-Soviet Russia, post-Soviet Kazakhstan, all the post-Soviet republics, that a lot of Ukrainians come to really regret their choice for voting for independence. What you get beginning in the 1990s is a great deal of ambivalence among Ukrainians about what Ukrainian is and how Ukrainian they are as opposed to Russian. and whether they even want an independent Ukraine that is aside from Russia. And that sentiment and that ambivalence only increases as Putin comes into power and revivifies Russia, even as Ukraine is still struggling. So by the point you get to 2014 and even 2022, with first the invasion of Donbas and Crimea and then the full-scale invasion, Ukraine is a place that is very much divided. Its identity is very much divided. There are nationalists, and then there are outright Russophiles who really do want to live under Putin and Russia. And then you have a lot of people who are kind of in between, who think they can have it both ways, who read Russian literature and watch Russian TV and speak in Russian, but they live in this place called Ukraine. I would argue it wasn't until the war in 2022 that Ukrainians really had to decide what they were. Are we Ukrainians or are we not? You remember that after 9/11, Americans faced a similar choice, I would argue. Before 9/11, it was kind of easy to be glib about patriotism and your thoughts about the American military. After 9/11, you, as an American, or at least I felt, I had to sort of decide, how American am I? How do I really feel about this place? What am I willing to do to defend this place or not? And that's the decision that Ukrainians were faced with in 2022. And the result of this war, as you know, is that it has created a nation in Ukraine unlike any that the Ukrainians could have created on their own without this war. I would say that Ukraine until 2022 was sort of still in its way an appendage of Russia. There was a kernel of truth to what Putin was arguing, that Ukraine is essentially Russia. Many Ukrainians felt that way, but now, as of 2022, Ukraine is a real nation, its own place, an entirely different place on the map. And I would say, the most important country in existence right now in terms of what it's fighting for and the prowess with which it's fighting.
Yeah. Okay. So there's so much here to unpack, James. And, it feels like, just reading through the book and then talking to you, this is a massive backfire on the part of Putin. And I remember, when I was in graduate school talking to one of my professors about Russia, I was like, I was kind of like, Russia is still this thing. He's like, are they? He's like, I remember he was speaking to actually the demographic decline of Russia and things. And as I look at this now, I look at this invasion of Ukraine, at least from my perspective, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it feels to me as though it's an act of desperation, like, kind of shielded in this like move of military power. But Putin doesn't care about culture. There's got to be reasons why he's invading Ukraine, right? Is it the fields? Is it the machinery? Like, what's in it for Russia to reclaim Ukraine or to claim Ukraine?
Okay, so we got two things there: the desperation and the motives behind the war. Let's begin with the motives. I do think that this is a cultural war. I don't think, for several reasons, I don't think this is a war about resources or territory or industry or grain or sunflower seeds, which is the Ukraine's second largest export, I think. No, I think there's a few good pieces of evidence for that. One is that, as we discussed, Putin, until 2022, was the eminent pragmatist. He was a master of realpolitik, such that when he annexed Crimea in the course of 3 weeks in 2014, Henry Kissinger praised him, called him a serious strategist, which was high praise from Kissinger. If this were a war about resources, it would make more sense. And I think it would be a much more limited war. It would be more in Putin's tradition as pragmatic. But the fact is, Russia doesn't really need anything that Ukraine has. No, I think that this is a war about an idea. This is a war about a single idea, the idea that Ukraine does not exist, that it does not deserve to exist. That's an idea that has been floating around Russia, as we discussed, since at least the mid-19th century, and grew in strength beginning in the 1990s. Beginning in the 1990s, early 1990s, as soon as Ukraine became independent, there were people in Russia, many of them, high and low, arguing that Ukraine should not be allowed independence. It could not be allowed independence. Everyone from Solzhenitsyn to Gromyko was making this argument. Maybe not Gromyko, but high statesmen were making this argument, and it was a very common feeling, even among intellectuals such as Solzhenitsyn, that you would be somehow tearing something fundamental out of Russia if Ukraine was allowed to become an independent state. It's a very common belief. Putin. It was also a common belief in the late 90s among Russian strategists that Ukraine would become a threat to Russia via NATO, which of course is what Putin has argued all along, that it is a threat to Russia because of NATO. But Putin had never really voiced these sentiments until around 2004, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And Putin appears to have become convinced that when Yanukovych was tossed out and Yushchenko won in 2004 in Ukraine, that it was not a spontaneous indigenous uprising in Ukraine, that in fact this was a Western conspiracy. And between 2004 and 2022, he became increasingly of the opinion, as many people had been for a long time, that Ukraine that cannot be allowed to exist, that it presented not just a strategic threat to Russia because of NATO, because of its place on the Black Sea, because of other things, but also it presented a moral threat to Russia, that Ukraine was this sort of westernized thorn in Russia's side, that Ukraine was this vector for Western contamination into Russia. And again, very old notion. That idea goes back to the 19th century. Putin didn't come up with it, but I think he convinced himself of it. I don't see Putin launching this war out of any practical impetus. You can't extrapolate from the invasion of Georgia and the invasion of Chechnya and the invasion of Donbas and Crimea in 2014 and arrive at 2022. It's a different vein of thought. It's a more irrational portion of his brain. And this war, more than those other wars, comes out of an idea, which is that Ukraine cannot be allowed to exist independently, that it ought not exist, that its existence was a misturn of history. You'd asked about desperation. I tend not, well, Kremlinology is a fool's errand with Putin's Kremlin. It always has been. His Kremlin has never had a relationship with the independent Ukrainian media. Well, not never, but has long not had any relationship with independent media. There is no longer any independent media in Russia, really, to speak of. And so it's very difficult for us to speculate as to Putin's mind in 2022 on the eve of the war. I didn't get a sense of desperation, but I well could be wrong. It could be that he was feeling desperate about something. What that something was, I can't imagine. But it could be that he was. It could be that he really had convinced himself that NATO was, about to invade Russia via Ukraine, which God knows, where he was getting his ideas, but it's possible he thought that. I tend to doubt it, given how savvy he was until that point. If he wasn't desperate in 2022, I have to imagine he's desperate now. Within the last few months, Ukraine has turned the tide of this war in so many ways, tactically, technologically, bringing the war into Russia in a way that it hasn't done since the invasion of Kursk, such that Russian civilians are now protesting the war again, risking, being thrown in jail, doing that. And the casualty rates, of course, at this point have become, I think the latest estimate is 1 million casualties, and we don't know how many of those are dead. It could be as many as 500,000. So if Putin isn't desperate at the moment, I don't know what he's thinking. He ought to be desperate, not just because Ukraine has him on the back foot and Ukraine is improving every day, but also because he's now facing the real possibility of some sort of popular uprising in Russia if Russian men continue to die at these rates.
Yeah, this feels, James, maybe I'm wrong here, but this feels like a giant tell on the part of the Russians, which is like they went into what should have been an easy job, looking from the outside, this smaller country versus this once
Yeah.
powerful empire. And right now, it seems like they're getting their asses kicked here.
Mm,
And you talk a little bit about this as far as the bombing of the theater itself, these using of these dumb bombs.
yeah.
We saw early in the conflict these old, antiquated tanks that were decades old. Like, what does this conflict tell us about the state of Russian war readiness?
Nothing good, obviously. I mean, that story has all changed. Within the last four plus years, Russia has improved a great deal, as of course as Ukraine. And until very recently, they were improving more or less in lockstep, which is why the war was so stagnant for so long. Um, but certainly at the beginning of the war, it was obvious. There, you know who Ruth Ben Gayat is,
Mm-hmm.
the subset. So she's very good on this. You know, she talks about the way in which authoritarians and strongmen, they rely on the military and they create these militaristic states and they present themselves as highly militaristic people. But one thing they do without fail is they also preside over kleptocracies in which the militaries are gutted and hollowed out by corruption and by simony, and that's it's clear that that had happened in the Russian military. It was shot through with corruption and theft, which is why you saw this mass equipment failure at the beginning, and also shot through with poor training or no training at all. Also clearly shot through with a complete lack of regard for its own troops, as I saw many times, in the battlefronts around Kharkiv and elsewhere, just Russian troops lying around on roads and in fields. They'd been abandoned by their commanders. Um, the yeah, so like a very low level of morale and preparation and equipment at the beginning of the war. I mean, to be honest, I'm much more surprised that Russia has lasted this long than that Ukraine has lasted this long. Um, and Russia was, as of not that long ago, not that many months ago, it looked like Russia, was really on the offensive. But now the technological gains are commensurate, except for in the drone war, where the Ukrainians are pulling ahead. And now the problem, I think, on the Russian side isn't necessarily incompetence or equipment, although the Ukrainians are still destroying a lot of Russian equipment. It may just be numbers of bodies. That Russia may just not have the bodies to sustain these casualty rates.
Yeah, but can Russia afford to lose this war? Can Putin afford? Like, how does Russia get out of this war
Yeah,
with Putin saving face? Because I think ultimately Putin's mostly. I mean, Putin's got to be concerned about his own control. He's got such a
yeah,
tight grip on things. If they back out without winning, whatever that looks like, whatever
yeah,
they can claim that is, what does
yeah.
that do for him? What does that do to him? And what does that do to Russia on a global stage?
Putin has no good options. Russia may have some good options if we want to hold out. Um, Probably not very. If we want to hold out some kind of hope and think that there might be some better alternative to Putin in Russia, which I tend to doubt, it could be that Russia as a country has better options right now. But Putin certainly does not have any good options now. What are his options? His options are to try to sue for peace immediately while insisting on keeping some captured lands. The Ukrainians are never going to stand for that. They are not going to allow Russia to offer a peace agreement that includes Russia keeping captured lands. The Ukrainians simply won't allow it. Zelensky won't allow it, and nor will the Ukrainians themselves. And Putin's not going to offer it. Not anytime soon. Putin is not going to offer a peace agreement. Um, let's say by this won't happen, but let's have a thought experiment. Let's say that Putin offers a peace agreement that allows Russia to keep some of its captured lands, and Zelensky signs the document for some reason. It won't matter what's on the document because the Ukrainians themselves would never stand for that. He might try to stand the Ukrainian military down, but Ukrainian civilians at that point would go behind the Russian lines and they would fight a guerrilla war. is what they would do. I think Putin knows this. I hope he knows how galvanized the Ukrainians are and how intent they are on taking back every inch of land that Russia's taken since 22, and possibly even the portions of Donbas and Crimea that Putin took in 2014. What are his other options? He could, let's say by some wacky thought experiment that Putin decided to pull out of all of the captured lands captured since 2022 and say, I'm sorry. Here's the land we captured since 2022. Here's it back. We just want peace. I don't think Ukrainians would even stand for that. I think at this point, Ukrainians want Crimea back, and they want what was formerly known as the DPR and the LPR back, those portions of Donbas that Russia seized with the separatists in 2014. So even if Putin, I think, wanted to roll it back to the 2022 borders, that wouldn't be enough for many Ukrainians in the military, in the high command, and civilians. Not that he would ever offer that. So what are his options? I think at the moment, his only option in order to continue prosecuting this war, which is to stay in power, because eventually for someone like Putin, like someone like Trump, the only real point is to stay in power. If he wants to stay in power with the war going as it is, what are his options? Escalate. The only thing I can think of for him is escalate. And it could be that these bombings we saw over the weekend in Kyiv and south of Kyiv are the beginning of some form of major escalation to try to once again intimidate the Ukrainians into suing for a peace deal that allows him to keep some captured lands. But of course, the Ukrainians are not going to do that, not after 4 years of this. He's going to have to do that aerially, and escalation is going to have to be aerial. It's not going to be on the ground. He doesn't have the troops, nor the equipment, nor the tactics, nor the technology to do a serious offensive on the ground. It'll have to be from the air. And we know well from history, we know from World War II and Vietnam and you name it, that an air war is not going to make a people submit if they don't want to. He can bomb Kyiv all he likes. It's only going to galvanize the Ukrainians more. So where does that leave him? Well, that leaves him even more desperate. And I don't know what a desperate Putin is capable of doing. We've not really seen a desperate Putin until now. In 26 years in power, he's occasionally shown emotions, anger usually, but we've never seen a desperate Putin, which is what we're seeing now. And I think that's more frightening than anything. It's like a frightening or a desperate Trump. He's capable of anything, I think, including using weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, so that kind of gets to my head here, which is you and I both distinctly remember 1991. We both remember Hussein's invasion of Kuwait and the global response, which was one of the great things that George H.W. Bush ever did was creating that giant coalition to push back.
The coalition of the willing.
Right. Yeah. So here's my question. Why didn't that happen here?
Why didn't an international coalition?
Yeah, why wasn't there a pushback? Was it because of the threat of nuclear war? Is that what Putin is banking on? Is the idea that the West is going to come together and now he can sell this as Russia versus the West? But
well, if we remember just a few short years ago, there was a coalition. There was agreement between Washington and London and Brussels and Paris and Germany and the other countries that contributed, that they would form a coalition of sorts, providing the Ukrainians with arms, with funding, with all of the other forms of aid the Ukrainians wanted, and with a great deal of training. I would say, not most importantly, but very importantly, immediately the Americans and Brits and NATO began training Ukrainian soldiers in Poland and elsewhere. So there was a coalition of a sort. It didn't consist of a ground army, obviously. I would be interested to know to what extent Ukraine actually would have liked foreign troops on the ground. I should know more about this than I do. I tend to think that Ukraine also did not want, for a NATO army coming into Ukraine. Um, they probably recognized just what an escalation that would represent, and that their country would then become not just the victim of an invasion, but it would become like Belgium or France in World War I or World War II. It would be overrun by hundreds of thousands of soldiers from Russia and NATO. That was untenable, not just from NATO's perspective, but also from Ukraine's perspective. Much better try to be a victim of invasion who can fight back than be the middle ground for the two largest warring armies since the Second World War. Ukraine's already been through that. It didn't like the experience much in World War II. It didn't want to be that middle ground again. Um, Another reason I suspect that may be true is that the Ukrainians are very proud. And there are 45 million of them, or were before the war. And the common wisdom was that the Russian military was, vastly larger, vastly more skilled, the second or third largest military in the world, depending on how you count militaries, and that Ukraine's military was by comparison negligible, inconsiderable. Well, that was never the case. People were talking about that in early 2022, that the Russians would run roughshod over the Ukrainians. But if you were in Ukraine before the war, as I was, you saw that the Ukrainians were prepared in their way. They weren't prepared enough. I think they should have seen this coming from farther back. But they were prepared in their way. They were psychologically prepared, and they were prepared in terms of troops. They had a very large military, that punched way above at weight, and is now arguably the best trained, most experienced military in the world. So, at the beginning of the war, at least, I was really happy and relieved with how it played out. In that, Europe and NATO and the United States offered as much help as they could, short of starting a World War III with Russia,
Mm-hmm.
and the Ukrainians more than held their own. And they held their own not just on the battlefield, but in terms of hospitals and medical services and humanitarian services. When I was in Ukraine during the war, at the beginning of the war anyway, I didn't see any Médecins Sans Frontières tents or any UNHCR. It was the Ukrainians were taking care of their own as they knew they could. They could have used more help. I would argue they were a bit too proud on this score. But in any event, they were and are standing on their own. That was a good situation for a while until the war stagnated. I think, and now we're going to face different questions. It's not just a question of an invasion now. We're plus 4 years into the invasion. It's now a question of what does NATO and the United States do if Putin decides to really escalate. Using weapons of mass destruction. People are worried about him escalating beyond the borders of Ukraine, escalating into, say, the Baltic states, or even Poland. People talk about. I'm less worried about that. I don't see him doing that. What I see him doing is escalating the civilian killing in Ukraine in a really egregious way.
James, we were talking a little bit earlier about Russia's physical military strength, their tanks, their men with guns, and all of the things. And it feels like, as I read the book, the real strength of the Russian war machine is actually their propaganda machine. And I feel that at times here in the United States, it's obviously no surprise that they've got their hands all over the United States, trying to influence elections here. Can you talk about what you saw and what you understand to be the strengths there in their propaganda, and how that works to divide Ukrainian loyalties there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. I think you could make a very strong argument, if not an airtight argument, that the Russian information war has been much more successful than the actual war, the physical war. And that has long been Russia's strategy, right? Russia's actual military incursions are few and far between and generally short-lived. Chechnya was by far the longest, with the leveling of Grozny. But their incursion into Georgia was a couple of weeks. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 took 3 weeks. But what Russia has always done in between and betwixt those physical wars is the information war, and it is global, and it is pervasive, and it is ingenious, and it takes a lot of pages out of the Soviet propaganda playbook. Also takes pages out of the Tsarist propaganda playbook, and other propaganda playbooks that the Kremlin finds useful. And I think, in my observation, um, Russian active measures, propaganda, call it what you will. Propaganda is almost too limiting a term, because it is so pervasive and so widespread and so sort of creating this other world in which people can credulously dwell. But I think there are two main goals, sometimes occurring simultaneously, sometimes separately. And those goals are either to present a counter narrative, I think as Putin would see it, which is to say, a narrative other than the dominant Western narrative, whatever that might be, the narrative of the success of the West through capitalism and Judeo-Christianity, et cetera, et cetera. Present a counter narrative, not unlike the Slavophiles and Nicholas I did in the mid-19th century, having to create this new narrative about the glory that is Russia, that has nothing to do with Europe, that is its own thing entirely, with its own glorious past. So you have Putin and the Kremlin furthering that sort of counter narrative, and that counter narrative also includes, in recent years, Russia presenting itself not just as a sort of righteous empire, an empire of God, a holy empire, in opposition to the unholy, immoral Western empire. But Putin, in his speeches and essays in the last several years, has also talked about Russia being the protector of all of the oppressed and woebegone people of the world, all of these people around the world who for centuries have been oppressed by the West, by Western colonialism. And I think Putin would include in that Russia. He considers Russia to be a victim of Western colonialism, particularly in the 1990s, but not exclusively. So there's this narrative, this vision of the Russian Empire, this beneficent Russian Empire that he's tried to present to the world in the last several years. That's one goal. Another goal is just to sow confusion. Another goal is to pump out information into the world, whereby people say, well, I don't know who started this war. Clearly, Ukraine had something to do with it. It couldn't have all been Russia's fault. NATO must have been at fault. And you have people as intelligent as John Mearsheimer at Chicago, arguing that this war is NATO's fault, not Russia's fault. And you have people who really ought to know better, furthering these talking points all over the place. I mean, including in, the American, I won't say mainstream media, but the respectable media. There was a cover story in Harper's Magazine at the beginning of the war about how NATO and the United States had started this war. It was preposterous. But it shows you the effectiveness of this line of argument. You and I would call it propaganda. Other people would not. But the point of this is not necessarily to further a narrative or propagate a vision of Russia globally. Rather, it's to sow confusion. It's to make people question the facts they see before their eyes. It's to elicit the proposition that, as they say, everything is possible and nothing is true. And we can see the success of these efforts all over the world, including in the United States, can't we? Take a poll of Republicans in Congress, and you'll find any number of these points being made in all sincerity. Not that any of these people have ever been to Ukraine or Russia, but they make these points nonetheless. So yes, I think you could absolutely argue that the Russian information war has been much more successful than the physical war, and the most tragic evidence of that, the most tragic results of that, is in Ukraine itself, where for many years you had very Russophilic Ukrainians, including many Ukrainians I know well, including many Ukrainians who were in the theater, who for years believed the Russian line that was also the line of many Russophilic Ukrainians living in the east and the south of Ukraine, that Ukraine would be much better off as a Russian province, essentially. That it was that the project of independence was misbegotten from the start, and that Ukraine ought to live under Moscow. Everyone will be better off in that way. And you heard this constantly in places like Mariupol before the war. And the sad thing is that although that attitude, of course, is much less than it was in Ukraine before the war, it still absolutely exists in Ukraine. There's a woman who appears in the book. She's the grandmother of one of the main characters in the book, Olga. And Olga's grandmother was in the theater. She narrowly escaped with her life. Olga saved her. Unlike Olga and Olga's mother, Natalia, Olga's grandmother, did not leave Mariupol. She has stayed in Mariupol. And she, after the bombing of the theater, she was cursing the Russians like everyone else, and she was relieved to not be dead. But today, Olga's grandmother has now been living in Mariupol for 4 years under Russian occupation, and she has convinced herself, as the Kremlin claims, that it was Ukrainian saboteurs who bombed the theater and not Russian planes that bombed the theater. She's had to convince herself of this. I think it's a way for her to cope. It's a way for her to maintain an even keel in a Russian-occupied Ukrainian city. She has to tell herself this story. And it's, to my mind, that is the most, that's the most frightening and tragic result of Russian propaganda.
Can we talk a little bit? We're talking so much about Russia, or we're talking about Putin.
Yeah.
You were over there, James. You weren't there in Mariupol that day, thankfully. But can we talk about two things? First of all, what you saw over there, how you end up over there, and what you saw on the ground. And then also, I feel like we need to talk about Zelensky and how the Ukrainian people, as I understand it, before the conflict, Zelensky was people had mixed opinions about the man.
Yeah.
We here in the United States, I think most of us here tend to celebrate him, but I'm kind of wondering how was Zelensky doing over there?
Well, I'll try to combine the answers to those two things because they're related. So I started reporting in Ukraine in the summer of 2021, sensing that something might happen. I mean, you didn't have to be a genius to sense that something might be up, right? By the summer of 2021, Putin was doing the second major buildup of equipment and material and men on the Ukrainian borders since Biden had come into office. The first burst of the first buildup right after Biden came into office earlier that year, you could think, oh, this is just a sort of a show of force countering Biden. When the second major buildup began that summer, people began to think, oh, this might not just be a diplomatic ploy. This might not just be theatrical. This might be real. Anyone with military experience, as soon as they saw that ammunition was being shipped to the Ukrainian borders in the summer of 2021, could have told you there was going to be an invasion. I do not have military experience. I do not have high-placed sources in the military, so I was not savvy enough to know that. But I did know that something might be up, and I thought it was a good time to go and begin reporting because, as it happened, but as the world had forgot, there was already a war being fought in eastern Ukraine since 2014, the war in the Donbas. It was a stagnant war, and it was not a particularly lively war, but there was still shooting every day. There were still mortar attacks every day, artillery being shot every day, sniping every day, people dying every day on either side of the line. It was this low-grade shooting war that had been going on for 7.5 years. So when I went that summer of 2021, I spent most of my time in the Donbas or along the front line. And I found that this war indeed was going on. And I found that the Ukrainians were prepared for an invasion, although I thought not nearly prepared enough, looking at their fortifications and their positions along the, 250-mile front line going down the spine of Donbas. And as we discussed before, I also found a lot of ambivalence among Ukrainians. There were the Ukrainian military, the soldiers who were living in the Donbas, because it was in a sort of a no man's land. And they were, of course, very patriotic. But the Ukrainians living in the region were not. Many of them were very Russophilic and very ambivalent, if not outright hateful, of Kiev and of the Ukrainian soldiers. Many of them, these are Ukrainians, mind you, believed that it was the Ukrainians carrying on this war and not the separatists and the Russians. And that they were being punished in the middle of it. I found this attitude among a lot of Ukrainians living in the East and even the South. And so when I left Ukraine after that first reporting trip in September of 2021, a few months before the invasion, I had very grave doubts about Ukraine's ability to cohere as a nation in the event of a full-scale invasion. I'd seen this ambivalence everywhere and this exhaustion in the East. And a lot of Russophilic Ukrainians. And I also had my doubts about Zelensky. As you mentioned, Zelensky on the eve of the war was not a popular president. He had very low approval ratings. He had been voted into office on a really large majority, I want to say 70%, largely on the promise that he would negotiate on the return of portions of the Donbas to Ukraine, that he would negotiate with Putin. Putin had never taken Zelensky seriously. He had never entered into serious negotiations with him. The war had persisted. By 2022, many Ukrainians felt Zelensky was an empty suit, that he was out of his depth. And then the war started. And Zelensky soon enough proved that he was not out of his depth, that he was exactly in his depth. And when he said that line about, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, well, then we knew, right? And soon thereafter, a British diplomat called him, the Churchill of Ukraine. And I think that's absolutely apt. And he's continued in this vein. Sometimes it takes a war to bring out a warrior. No one knew that Zelensky was a warrior before this war. As it turns out, he is. And also, more importantly, and Zelensky is sort of an emblem of this, the Ukrainians, of course, cohered more cogently, more quickly, more cogently, more avidly than I had feared, than I think anyone could have guessed, including many Ukrainians. I know many Ukrainians are really surprised at how much Ukrainians have banded together in this war. And it seems to only be more so as the thing drags on. That's not to say that every Ukrainian feels that way. I still know plenty of Ukrainians in the East and South who are merely sick of the war. I know many, many Ukrainians, men of fighting age, who would never volunteer. If they're going to go into the military, they're going to have to be forced. They're going to have to be conscripted. They do not want to fight for Ukraine. Last time I was there, I met many young men who were not complaining about Russia. They were complaining about the corruption of the Ukrainian military, the indifference of the Ukrainian military to its troops' lives, some of which is true, unfortunately. So it's not to say that this nationalism and this willingness to fight it out to the bitter end to preserve this nation is a ubiquitous feeling in Ukraine. But it's more than it ever would have been before this war. This war has created a nation where before there was, I would say, a tentative post-Soviet republic.
We talked a little bit earlier about how does Putin get out of this war and able to save face? But how does Ukraine win this war? How does the world get out of this war? What has to happen here?
I really wish I knew that question. I think ultimately it's not difficult to see that whatever change takes place has to take place in Russia, right? It's you never know, especially with a place like Russia. There are coups and collapses in Russia all the time over the last however many centuries. It could be that Ukraine is really militarily successful over the next several months and is able to cripple the Russian hydrocarbon economy such that there is a coup in Moscow. I think that's unlikely, but again, you never know. It could be that Ukrainian military prowess, and particularly technologically, develops so quickly that they are able to run the Russians out of occupied Donbas and Kherson within the next year. I wouldn't bet on it, but it is possible. Um, but I think much more likely is that whatever major change occurs not in Ukraine but in Russia. What is that change going to look like? I am not hopeful. I am much more worried about what happens in Russia than what happens in Ukraine. The possibilities of what follows Putin in Russia are not do not give one hope. There is not a credible opposition in Russia. There is not a independent civil society in Russia. There is no longer a Navalny. There's no longer a Nemtsov. The opponents of this war have been silenced or exiled for 4 years. Given Russia's history, it's just as likely, when Gorbachev came into office, it was kind of miraculous. And then when Yeltsin followed him, it was even more miraculous until it wasn't. But that was a progression of sort of liberal-minded, peace-minded people falling one upon another in the wake of Andropov and Brezhnev. That was a remarkable period. The Russians don't look back at it with much nostalgia, but the West certainly does. The idea that a Putin, let's say that Putin is the Andropov of his time, even though he's been in office for 26 years, the idea of a series of increasingly liberal-minded, West-friendly leaders coming into office to replace Putin is highly unlikely at this point. The collective psychology in Moscow and the sort of the nature of officialdom in Moscow has just changed much too much for that. Putin's attitude, which he inherited from others, that Ukraine cannot be allowed to exist, that Russia is this holy empire with God-ordained borders that must be maintained, that Russia is the protector of Christianity. Those ideas are no longer radical or ultra ideals in Moscow. They are the official ideas of Moscow, and you do not reverse that shift in collective psychology overnight. There are now so many people in Russia who think and feel that way. You can't change it in the course of a few months in the way that the Soviet Union collapsed, and Yeltsin took power. That's not going to happen.
Do we get a sense, James, of like the varying ways in which Ukrainians are looking at the United States? It feels like we've had some pretty major shifts between the Biden administration and the Trump administration towards the conflict. Is Putin banking on Trump doing what he wants? Is Zelensky hoping that we can get another leader?
Yeah.
How are people there looking at us?
Yeah, well, of course, they're endlessly disappointed, as well they should be. Mm-hmm. It's not as though Americans' military support or other forms of support has ended. J.D. Vance claims it has, but that's not entirely true. There is still support, but of course, psychological support has declined precipitously. And I mean, ever since that mugging by Vance and Trump of Zelensky in the Oval Office at the beginning of the administration, what could be better evidence of a major shift in attitude? So the Ukrainians are endlessly disappointed in us, as they have every reason to be. Although, of course, Ukrainians, like any good-hearted person around the world, knows to distinguish between a citizen and their government, right? They don't. When I'm in Ukraine, they don't blame me for the American withdrawal or American cowardice. They know to blame the president and his administration for that. I have to imagine Zelensky is very eager to see who the next president is going to be, or the next Speaker of the House is going to be, the next Senate Majority Leader. I'm sad to say I think he'll be sorely disappointed in November, because there will not be normal elections in the U.S. But that's another matter. No, absolutely there won't be. But that's another matter. What is Putin thinking about Trump? I mean, at this point, Trump is irrelevant to Putin, right? Putin has never taken him seriously. Putin has never thought that Trump had the ability to negotiate an end to this war. No right-minded person could think that. Trump is neither capable nor interested in negotiating an end to this war. Even if he was a vastly better statesman who was much more respected, he couldn't negotiate an end to this war. even if he was able to devote more than 5 minutes to any single idea, he wouldn't be able to negotiate an end to this war. And increasingly, he's irrelevant to Putin's decision making. He's also increasingly irrelevant to Ukraine's decision making, as Ukraine tries to separate itself from American support. So it no longer really matters what Trump tries to do. People, Putin, Zelensky, the rest of them do not take him seriously. They know he's neither willing nor capable. And even if he spoke Russian, like Angela Merkel, neither Putin nor Zelensky would allow him to negotiate a peace that they didn't like. Certainly not Putin. I have to imagine that that Putin and Zelensky are looking much more towards Xi Jinping and Modi and other and to an extent Europe. Major trading partners with much more serious leaders who are able to create stability in their countries. If you were Zelensky or Putin, would you want anything from Trump right now? Probably not.
Stay away is what I would.
Yeah.
Is what I would.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's interesting because we started off talking about this warfare as really as demonstrative of Russia's relative weakness despite their bluster. And I'm kind of wondering here if maybe this might be symbolic of the United States fading on the global stage as well. The fact, not that the United States can't negotiate an end to a conflict, but that so many people are looking somewhere else for leadership.
Well, I would say two things. First of all, secondly, you're absolutely right. They have to look elsewhere. They would be fools not to look elsewhere. But secondly, I would argue that even at its most powerful, even at its most savvy, the United States' ability to create peace or negotiate peace anywhere in the world is vastly overstated. And it's an awful irony because when you go to these places, wherever it might be, I've worked in Gaza, I've worked in Ukraine, I've worked in Iraq, I've worked in many other places where people were hoping for American intervention, either diplomatic intervention or military intervention. And they hope for it. And then as soon as it comes, they claim that the Americans are interfering, that they're acting in an imperialist manner, that they are overstepping once again. You really, in the position of the United States, you can't win morally. And that's always been the case, even when we were stronger and smarter. But if you look at any ongoing conflict right now, whether it's Palestine and Israel, or Russia and the post-Soviet republics, or the wars in Africa, Congo, Sudan, you will in all of those places find American attempts to negotiate a peace or a peace that perhaps succeeded for a little while, but eventually could not address the fundamental problems in these places. So that capacity of ours, I think, has always been overstated. It's been overstated by Americans, certainly, and it's been overstated by foreign people as well.
James, as we're kind of coming to a close here, the question I've got here for you now is, you spent all this time in Ukraine, you've talked to all these people, you've seen all of these things over there. Do you get a sense as far as, is there something that the Ukrainian people, the people you've maintained contact with, want Americans to know about this war?
I think it's not just Americans. I think they want the whole world. Well, it depends on, the Ukrainian. I know a lot of Ukrainians who are patriotic and nationally minded and despise Russia, but they are so exhausted by this war that they don't necessarily want the world to recognize anything. All they want is an end to the war. And if that means the world, recognizing some untruth, then so be it, so long as there's an end to the fighting. But those who are willing to go on and keep fighting, I think what they want the world to know and Americans to know, and I think they know that the world and Americans already know this, is that the Ukrainians are fighting not just for Ukraine. They are fighting for a set of ideals that is enshrined, among other places, in the U.S. Constitution, but also in Britain's case in the Magna Carta and many documents since, in the French Constitution, in the German Constitution. These are the ideals of the open society, of free and fair elections, of representative government, of the free exchange of ideas, of a free press, of human rights, of equality before the law. Ukraine is not just fighting for the continued existence of the Republic of Ukraine, it's also fighting for the continued existence of these ideas and these ideals that we as Americans claim to hold dear, that some Americans even claim to have invented. And yet increasingly few of us seem willing to defend ourselves, which is why when I'm in Ukraine, I feel not only a sense of respect and admiration for the Ukrainians, I also feel a sense of envy or jealousy, because they are fighting for these ideas and these ideals in a way that I think very few Americans are any longer willing to fight. So I think Ukrainians want us to know, and are confident that we do know, that their fight is a much larger fight. It's a fight. It's a fight for everything that we and the Ukrainians like against everything we dislike. It's a fight for the open society against the closed society. It's a fight for representative government against totalitarianism.
It's a hell of a thought as we head into our 250th anniversary of our founding.
Yeah, yeah. I'm hoping to be in Ukraine for July 4th.
I hope you're safe there, pal. Speaking of which, you spent this time, you just wrote this amazing book, Theater.
Thank you.
The Theater, Courage and Survival in the Defining Atrocity of the Ukraine War. I picked it up on the plane, could not put it down. I told you before as we were talking how much I loved it. This is our third attempt to do this because I was so adamant about doing this pod because I felt so strongly about the book. What comes next for you? Where do you go now? What happens?
Well, Jason, I've been writing about war for a long time. And while I quite enjoy writing about war, I do need to find sort of other things to love. It's a kind of unhealthy attachment that I have to this line of work. So while if I could, I would love to go to Iran, of course, but that would never happen. I would want to go to Gaza. It's very unlikely that will happen anytime soon. I would love to go cover the war in Burma, but that's going to be a tough one. In terms of kind of very extreme things, I'm planning to go to Jakarta in the rainy season later this year, early next year, to write about what life is like on the bleeding edge of climate change, because Jakarta, more than any other city in the world, is being affected by rising sea levels and depleting aquifers and the increasing force of tsunamis, or rather typhoons. So I'm going to go live there through the rainy season and write about how there are these people who live in Jakarta who live essentially submerged for weeks, if not months out of the year. So I'm going to go there later this year. I'm doing a big project about global rock art and recent discoveries in the study of ancient rock art, which is why I had asked you before about the rock art of the Comanche. And some other things that I'm gonna, that can help me sort of love humanity and admire humanity without having to watch humans shoot at each other.
Well, I definitely wish you to come back when you talk about this, when you go to Jakarta, because this is a fascinating subject to me. It's something that I'm very, very much interested in talking about. So
yeah, I'd love to come back.
Buddy, I can't thank you enough for taking the time for writing this
Jason.
book. For
it's
taking
been a
time.
Great pleasure.
Dude, this was great. So thank you so very much for coming in today.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me. It was great.
And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so much to our guest, James Verini. You can find his book, The Theater, Courage and Survival in the Defining Atrocity of the Ukraine War. It's out, available right now. You can get it today. Thank you, James, for coming in and talking to me about what's going on over there. Thank you for talking to all of us. Thank you to my producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. I just asked Fletcher to turn this around super fast so we could get this in front of you guys as soon as we could. So thank you, Fletcher, for making the time this morning to do this. And thank you, of course, to all of you guys for tuning in and listening to this podcast, for showing your support for what we're trying to do here. If you like our work, make sure you show support by sharing this with your friends, by leaving us some reviews on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen, and subscribe to this pod. We've got a lot of stuff coming for you soon. We're recording some more later today and also tomorrow. So stick around. Thanks for being here. Ciao for now. Bye.